have these pictures in cities in North Mexico and in the south of the United States. They were all mostly yellow because you have the desert. So you have something that may be an interpretation of green area, but since it was
not so strong winter.
Sorry?
Not so strong winter.
Not so strong winter, yes. No, but when let's say when you're trying to make the correlation with air quality and how very useful, let's say the green areas in a city are in order to, let's say, clean up the air. We are trying to move, let's say, the correlations on that direction. But so far, for example, we've found that one indicator that is really, really important and very, very correlated is actually the number of monitoring stations. Usually when a city really has this commitment and allocate funds to have the proper number of monitoring stations, usually it means that they are actually doing important efforts in order to improve the air quality.
And you study only like question for pollution?
There are 4 indicators regarding air quality. One of them is 2.5 PM 10 monitoring station, and there is another one that I don't remember. Basically, those are the indicators. Yes. And allow me to mention something. And this is actually a very, very important message or idea about CPI, is that CPI is, let's say, a first diagnosis. I mean, when you see, for example, that something is noting or having a very, very low value, it means that you have to make further assessments on that. But let's say that the first photograph, again, I mean, we're on a parachute. CPI, let's say we are like 500 meters or probably 1 kilometer above the surface. If you want to have more knowledge about a specific issue, you really have to go further on that. So there is a specific scope of the index.
Thanks for the interesting lecture. I have a question on the data. First, on the statistical data, how reliable is it, for example, in Russia with Eurostat or in any country? So, reliability of statistical data. And then you said you double check your information by asking, like the survey, asking people. But, well, I am a qualitative researcher and I would be very skeptical about your questions, because if you ask people if they are like, I don't know, if they think that there are enough green spaces, this might be just politicized, you know? Maybe it was just topical and politicized through the governor or through newspapers. Also, if you ask people, do you have, are these spaces accessible for all persons? How can a non-disabled person know? They will say, yeah, sure it is, from its own experience, but, so, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic questions, both of them. And the first one, relating let's say the quantitative, qualitative data, take into account that hard data is hard data. I mean, we are not touching, let's say, the numeric indicators. But what we're saying, you know, the thing is that in some indicators, usually the result is not really easy to make interpretation. And I will give you a very good example, for example, in my own country. We actually measure, one of the sub-dimensions is regarding to gender issues. And in gender issues, you have 3 indicators. One of them is access to secondary school by girls, something like that, which, for example, in many countries in Latin America is something that we have done since 20 years ago. So I mean, it's like an easy indicator for countries like Mexico. But of course, I mean, the perception of gender inclusion in society is completely different. So when we presented, for example, the results, and we had actually numbers of 97, like the same than in Sweden, you know, so, and of course Mexico is not Sweden. But we had another indicator that was actually extremely interesting and more pertinent, because we actually measured the number of women on let's say, decision-making positions, for example, governments and the parliament, you know, on the first circle of decision-making. So it really gave you it really gave you a wider, how can I say, a wider spectrum of the inputs that we're putting. But of course, we're not getting rid of the secondary school indicator. I mean, we put it there because it's something that the country actually achieved. I mean, of course, it's not that it's really difficult to make an interpretation based on that indicator, because again, I mean, that indicator was so high. But what we're trying to put, let's say, on the picture is that indicator, but also regarding, for example, the perception indicator. So we want to show, let's say, the full picture. And this is actually something very important with difficult, how can I say, or very technical indicators. For example, we have one indicator that measures sprawl. You know that something really, really important for us as an agency is the idea of density. We are actually promoting cities with a proper density. And many cities in many countries actually they're growing a lot. But in the perception, this is actually like the opposite. I mean, let's say normal people, like my parents, I mean, they're not really aware that this kind of sprawling is bad. And it's really interesting because, for example, when you have the hard data of a sprawl in some cities, it's really bad. And when you, for example, conduct a question regarding that matter, people really are not aware that sprawl is actually something negative. So again, here the information, the principle is to have, let's say, a vast quantity of information. And you know, information is power. I mean, and if you have, let's say, a fuller and wider set of indicators, whether quantitative or qualitative, actually you will be having more inputs in order to make interpretations. That is the principle. But the main idea is that, of course, we do not touch the quantitative indicator. I mean, the quantitative indicator is the quantitative indicator. Regarding the reliability, so far, I've been personally very surprised regarding the availability, because many of the indicators is available. And we were very surprised because the portal of Rostad is actually, I mean, the quality is really high. Also, for example, regarding many of the territorial indicators is available. I'm not going to go to the specifics, but I really want to mention that in many of the exercises that we have done in other cities, I mean, information is very sensitive. I mean, information can be very sensitive, but so far, I mean, here has been quite positive. I mean, that 80%, believe me, is a very positive number for us. The 80% of green indicators.
But this is the accessibility, but how reliable is the data? Well, in general, not only in Russia. So it's like official data. We could assume that globally seen, maybe some states have an interest in, you know, I don't know.
Yes.
How reliable is it? So not about the accessibility, but also the reliability. How do you check it? And with the qualitative things, do you have local experts involved helping you interpreting the data always? Or how is this process going on?
Local, I mean, the local partners are fundamental, really fundamental. I mean, and that is why we are so lucky actually to have this partnership with Thompson State University, because they're actually doing all this local part. This is a teamwork. Mm-hmm. We provide, let's say, the global knowledge and let's say the global expertise and so on, but just as you mentioned, I mean, it has to be, we cannot be that arrogant in order just to get there and to start all our measurement. We definitely need the local knowledge. Regarding reliability, thank you, reliability. So far, in general, we have, from my understanding, in general, we have found reliable data in many countries. The interesting part of us is actually not regarding reliability. It's actually availability, because it's something that is actually more common to find. Of course, there are some, and let me. I think that this is going to be more interesting the answer. Regarding reliability, what we have seen is actually a difference between national governments and local governments. Usually national governments, since they have stronger technical capacities, usually the information is more reliable and accurate and coherent. And usually local governments, since they have less technical capacities, you know, for example, solid waste, which is something really common, or again, urban mobility. I mean, they do not have the capacity to make measures every year or every 2 years because, you know, the resources in public finance in a city are limited. So that is actually where we find this kind of issues, more let's say, between the national and the local government.
¿Puedo preguntar en español o mejor en inglés?
En español.
Me interesa porque ha elegido usted exactamente Tomsk y me parece es claro que Moscú, por ejemplo, es demasiado obvio y usted necesitó alguna ciudad con algún potencial para desarrollar, pero una vez más, ¿por qué Tomsk?
Yes, I'm going to answer in English. So the question is why Tomsk, basically. I mean, of course, it was a longer explanation. No, here let's say it's about the partnerships. I mean, of course, it's a common way we operate. Let's say through invitation and possibilities. But I have to say that regarding let's say the size of the cities, what we have seen so far also with this research is that, let's say, Russian cities are in two different baskets. You have the global megacities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, that what I'm trying to say is that they have a completely different reality, a completely different set of challenges. Of course, they do have a lot of challenges, even related to the SDGs implementation. And then you have the intermediate cities, I mean, thinking from Novosibirsk until, I don't know, almost 500,000. And we have seen actually that there is this huge difference. And even if Moscow is so dominant at the national level, which is obvious, if you sum the amount of the population living in all those intermediate cities is actually bigger. So it is actually a very interesting, I mean, it's not a contradiction, but it's a really, really interesting reality. But just summarizing why, I mean, because let's say it was more like a partnership thing. Gracias.
Окей. Еще есть вопросы?
А как все-таки считается этот индекс? Или он качественный? Или он как вот одна цифра получается, одна как на конце? Вот из этого всего. Я не понимаю.
Can you translate his question?
He would like to know exactly how you calculate this index.
The methodology.
The methodology?
We have it actually.
We have a methodology, yes, and it's open and available. We will have a Russian version, I mean, translated. We're still working on the let's say on the document. It has been translated, but the English version is available.
And is the calculation based mostly on quantitative data or also on qualitative data?
No, it's mostly 100% quantitative.
Maybe it was just because of your question on the qualitative questions. Do you want to expand a little bit on the perception index role? Because, I mean, as we just said, the CPI very much is on quantitative data. But then when we get controversial questions, and that actually comes to your question around the reliability of data, like if you're having a public discussion and there's a lot of questions on, we really don't think the air pollution is that, you know, little of a problem in Tomsk, I'm just saying for an example, you know, then that's when you start adding in more qualitative information, isn't it? Because the CPI, as Louis said from the beginning, the data is interesting, but it's more interesting is the tool for participatory discussion, right? So if it triggers questions, that's when, as I understand it, you need to have more qualitative
Yes.
data. Is that correct?
That is very
Yeah.
good, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, a colleague of mine, he has a very interesting metaphor. He says that when we have fever, I mean, we may have 37 degrees of fever, but one person may feel it in one way, and other person may feel it in another way. So it's exactly this kind of thing. I'm thinking, for example, about air pollution. But yes, we do have another methodology. Let's say the fundamental CPA methodology is basically quantitative. But since we actually want to go further in this analysis, we produce, let's say, some kind of parallel, or how can I say, like a complementary methodology of CPA, which is fully qualitative. Let's say we have 62 quantitative indicators, and on the other methodology we have 62 also, but in this case qualitative indicators. So it's really interesting because when you overlap both, a lot of really interesting things happen. In many of the things that you're actually measuring, there is a common. The result is very, very similar. It means that, let's say, that the number and the perception of that is you don't see many difference, but in other things it might be very, very different. And I think one fantastic example of this is, let's say, for example, urban safety. Of course, for example, when you make the qualitative exercise, and for example, if you disaggregate by gender, of course, it's very different, the kind of results, the kind of answers you're going to get from a female perspective than from a male perspective. And again, it's really interesting because all this kind of data is actually the basis to have a fantastic gender discussion about how actually to implement and to strengthen the gender perspective on urban planning.
Maybe also for people to know the data that we have collected so far in TOMS is what we're calling an extended set, but it's more or less the basic set of indicators which, if you are participating city, it's really important that you complete as much of the data available as possible to make it comparative with the other 500 cities that we have in the data set. Because if you don't complete those basic ones, there are gaps, and then you can't make those kind of comparison, right? But another step that might happen in TOMS is that as you go more into policy discussions, we sometimes add in more contextual indicators, which are, very much coming from that city itself, like really specific needs, not just qualitative but actually quantitative indicators as well. So that will enrich it further if that step is required.
Yes.
So I was in charge of, this is not my function now, I mean, I'm working with Russia and CIS, but a few years ago I was based in Saudi Arabia, and we were implementing the City Prosperity Index in Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of questions around what you're asking now, the reliability of data, is it very, I would say, is something being hidden behind the official data, in a way. But we really try to just take the data for what it was and then work with it in terms of discussion. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would like to add something. Thank you for bringing this to the table. In TOMS, let's say that the original idea, again, I mean, it's not just to have the number, and there is a very interesting discussion regarding quality of life. And again, I mean, how, let's say, this university town can improve the quality of its quality of life through actually all this kind of urban spaces. And that is actually why we actually were very, very interested into conducting this kind of exercise of questions. And actually, I think that it answers a little bit the other question you did. I mean, we definitely try to contextualize. When we arrive to a city, we definitely try to adapt of what the city actually needs. Again, I mean, the case of Moscow is completely different. It's more about another kind of narrative, of course, another kind of scale. But still, I mean, there are many synergies and many reasons to eventually calculate it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Lisa, could you just say a few words about the internship that you're going to have?
Yes. Yes, we're looking for candidates, because we're actually working on this project. We have many things that are coming in the next future. So if any of you is interested, the position is actually to be based here in Moscow. Our office is near Itartas building. So if any of you is interested, just let us know.
I guess when we have a vacancy or something that we can share.
It will be better if he can give information and we put it.
Yes, we will provide
Yes, it will be
information
better.
and it will
Yes.
include on the
Because now, unfortunately, not
on
all the
the-
students are here because everybody has a lectures and so on.
problem on your Facebook account.
Yes, of course. Maybe you want to say a few words to our students, maybe Lisa, or maybe to
Yeah, I can say just a few words because I think we went straight into the presentation. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of UN-Habitat, the UN Human Settlements Program. But we are one of the UN agencies, and our headquarters is in Nairobi, in Kenya. That's where Luis and I work. But then we have an office here in Moscow, and that office is a sub-regional office, so it works with programs in Russian Federation, like the Project in Toms, but we're also doing a lot of technical support to countries of the CIS, so the former Soviet Republics. And we're actually, right now UN-Habitat is advancing a new strategic plan. We are really known in the UN system as the city agency, so sustainable urbanization is what we are working on. And for those of you who are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really SDG 11 on sustainable cities. That is like our main guiding document. But as Luis explained, the City Prosperity Index also really helps to guide a lot of that work. We have regional offices in many different, we're global. And one of the reasons why I really think that we are here now in Moscow and visiting is that with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and also the New Urban Agenda, the global community really acknowledged that urbanization issues is not a problem only of countries in the so-called developing world. There is a perception that what we do, what the UN is doing on urbanization has to do with slums in Africa, dealing with shelter and conflicts, which is all true. We have a very strong presence in these areas. But we really come to see that many of the issues of urbanization have a lot of common issues also in countries such as Russia. And I'm from Sweden. We are also working a lot now on SDG reports, New Urban Agenda reports, also for Sweden. And I think it's a very exciting time, as a professional to see more of those synergies and to see the urbanization needs that we have in common. And we work in many different environments. This is not the forum for that, but even through this program we're looking at, we hope, to get research funding to look at settlements in the Arctic, for example. So this is now very far away from discussing slums in southern Africa. And Russia will be most of the cities of the Arctic are actually in Russia. So if that would be a research project, for example, that really brings in Russia. We work on many different aspects of urbanization. I think CPI, really summarizes our conceptual framework that sustainable urbanization has to do with environmental issues, but not only that. I think sometimes you mix up the word sustainable with ecological or environment. It's equally important to address economic issues, inequalities. We see growing inequalities in many cities that even has high GDP, economic productivity. We discuss a lot, which is interesting, I think, even for Russia, shrinking cities. What happens to these kind of mono-economic cities? Cities are shrinking. It's not just about urbanization and dealing with megacities. And then, of course, the social aspects, social inclusion, such a huge trend now of dealing with internal and external migration, respect for diversity. So we're really dealing with the whole holistic part of it. And at the heart of all this is also governance issues, local government, and of course national government as well. But we really work a lot at the municipal level in terms of strengthening local governance. So participatory methods, which I know is very interesting here in Russia, is something that we really advocate for. And we do have a lot of programs related to urban planning and design. So we work here in Russia. Our line ministry is the Ministry of Construction. We sit on their advisory council. They're very interested in particular in our technical expertise when it comes to improving the living environment, public spaces. These are some of the topics that we work on. So happy to share with you any information you like, maybe through you, We try as much as possible to translate key documents into Russian, but I can see here English and Espanol and many other languages. So, but we'd be more than happy to continue the dialogue with you on areas that you're interested in. Yeah. Thank you.
If I could add just a couple of words, I'd like to thank Irina for the excellent cooperation which we are having in general and in particular for organizing this lecture at such a short notice. And I hope that our cooperation will expand and continue, and it's always a pleasure to come to the Moscow Higher School of Economics. And I would like to thank you all for your participation and for your excellent questions. And I hope that in this room, or somewhere very close to this room, there's our future intern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the lecture, for your very interesting presentation, and for your answer to questions. It's very interesting for us. Окей, спасибо большое, друзья. Давайте, если что, обращайтесь в наш институт, и мы тогда передадим все ваши вопросы нашим участникам, Джоси Джонсону, Татьяне Комаровой, потому что действительно одна из задач сейчас устойчивого развития, цели, которые вы все знаете прекрасно, это, так сказать, максимальная имплементация в нашу жизнь, и, конечно, молодые в первую очередь должны этим заниматься. Спасибо большое. Спасибо.